The city lights flickered against the rain-slicked pavement as Aaliyah and Zuri Johnson walked home from their after-school study session. The twin sisters, both 16, had stayed late to prepare for an upcoming debate competition. The air was crisp with the early autumn breeze, and the sound of their sneakers tapping against the concrete sidewalk was nearly drowned out by the honking of cars and distant chatter of pedestrians. Aaliyah, always the more observant one, noticed the police cruiser slowing down as it passed by. She nudged Zuri. "That cop's been circling the block," she murmured. Zuri, more carefree, waved a hand dismissively. "Maybe he's just on patrol." But the car pulled over abruptly, and the driver's side door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, adjusting his utility belt. His name tag gleamed under the dim streetlights, Officer Richard Calloway. "You too," he barked. "Come here." Aaliyah stiffened, exchanging a glance with her sister. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked cautiously. Calloway's pale blue eyes narrowed as he studied them, his lips curling slightly in distaste. "Where are you coming from?" Zuri frowned. "From school. We just finished studying." Calloway scoffed. "Studying? Huh? What's in the bags?" Aaliyah clutched her backpack instinctively. "Our books. Our laptops. School stuff." "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. But his tone made it clear that it wasn't a request. Aaliyah hesitated. Do we have to? We haven't done anything wrong." Calloway's jaw clenched. "You're acting suspicious. I got reports about 2 girls matching your description shoplifting in the area. You wouldn't happen to be them, would you?" Zuri's mouth fell open. "What? No, we didn't steal anything." "Hands on the wall," Calloway ordered. Fear shot through Aaliyah's veins. This isn't right." Calloway stepped closer, towering over them. "Are you resisting an officer of the law?" Aaliyah swallowed hard, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. They had seen this before, on the news, on social media. Black teenagers getting harassed, arrested, hurt, sometimes worse. But never had they imagined it would happen to them. The world seemed to slow as Calloway grabbed Zuri by the wrist and yanked her forward. She stumbled, catching herself against the cold, rough brick of the building. "Hey!" Aaliyah shouted, reaching for her sister. But Calloway turned sharply. "Step back," he snarled. "Both of you. Hands where I can see him." Zuri's breath came in ragged gasps. "You don't have the right to do this." "Shut up." Calloway kicked her backpack aside and began patting her down, his gloved hands rough and forceful. Zuri flinched, biting her lip to hold back tears. Aaliyah's fists clenched. "She's 16. You bastard. You can't." Before she could finish, Calloway spun, gripping her shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Watch your mouth. Girl, keep talking, and I'll make sure you regret it." A small crowd had begun to gather. A man in a suit hesitated before pulling out his phone to record. Another woman murmured to her friend, her voice uncertain. "Maybe they did something," someone whispered. "Or maybe it's just another case of profiling." Another said bitterly. Aaliyah's face burned with shame. She and her sister weren't criminals. They weren't threats. They were just 2 girls trying to get home. Calloway finished frisking Zuri and moved to Aaliyah. "Turn around." Aaliyah's entire body trembled with rage. "We're the daughters of Marcus Johnson." She spat. Calloway's eyes flickered with something unreadable before he let out a slow, mocking laugh. "Yeah? And I'm the King of England." He shoved her against the wall, pressing her cheek against the cold stone. "Now shut up and let me do my job." Humiliation boiled inside her, but she forced herself to stay silent. She couldn't breathe. The video hit the internet within hours. By morning, it had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. It was everywhere, on Twitter, on Instagram, on major news networks. The headlines were damning. Police officer assaults black teen sisters in broad daylight. Racial profiling or law enforcement? Public outrage grows. Daughters of Interior Minister victims of police brutality. The footage was undeniable. Calloway, sneering as he threw Aaliyah and Zuri against the wall. The fear in their eyes. The way he humiliated them, manhandling them like criminals. Marcus Johnson saw it while sitting in his office. At first, he didn't believe what he was watching. But when he recognized his daughters, his girls, his babies, his vision went red. His phone rang. His secretary. "Sir, the press is already calling." Marcus didn't answer. He was already grabbing his coat. The police department would regret ever touching his children. The entire city felt the tension. By the time Marcus Johnson arrived at the police precinct, reporters were already swarming the entrance. Cameramen shouted questions. "Mr. Johnson, do you have a statement? Will you be pressing charges? Do you believe this was a racist attack?" Marcus ignored them, shoving past the crowd with his security detail. The moment he stepped inside, officers scrambled out of his way. "Where's your chief?" he demanded, his voice booming. A nervous young officer pointed toward an office at the end of the hall. Marcus stormed inside without knocking. Chief Warren, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, looked up from his desk. "Mr. Johnson, save it." Marcus cut him off. He threw his phone on the desk, the paused video glaring up at them. "Explain this to me." Warren exhaled heavily. There's a procedure." "Mr. Johnson." Officer Calloway suspected. "Suspected what?" Marcus roared. "That my daughters were criminals? Because they were black? Because they were in the wrong neighborhood?" Warren rubbed his temples. "I understand you're upset, but let's not jump to conclusions." Marcus slammed his fist on the desk. "Your officer put his hands on my daughters. My 16-year-old daughters. He humiliated them. He violated them. If you think I'm going to let this slide, you're a fool." The chief hesitated. "We will handle this internally." Marcus laughed coldly. "No, you won't. I'm going public with this. I'm pressing charges, and I will make sure that Richard Calloway never wears a badge again." Warren sighed. "Johnson, I need you to be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Marcus hissed. "You have 1 hour to suspend that man, or I will destroy you." He turned and walked out, his fury burning a path behind him. This wasn't just about his daughters anymore. This was war. The press conference was called within 24 hours. The weight of the incident bore down on Marcus Johnson like a suffocating fog. But it did not weaken him, it only sharpened his resolve. The room was packed with journalists, cameras flashing like a relentless thunderstorm. Aaliyah and Zuri sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly under the table. Their father stood before them, his face a mask of controlled fury as he addressed the nation. "My daughters were brutalized by a man who was supposed to serve and protect them." Marcus's voice boomed through the microphones. Officer Richard Calloway didn't see 2 students walking home. He saw 2 black girls and made his judgment before they had spoken a word. He humiliated them, assaulted them, and ignored their cries for justice. The room was dead silent except for the frantic clicking of keyboards as reporters captured every word. "This is not just about my children," Marcus continued, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "This is about every black child who has been harassed, every family who has mourned a life stolen by police violence, every voice that has been silenced by a broken system. But hear me when I say this, we will not be silent. Not today, not ever." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Questions exploded from every direction. "Mr. Johnson, are you calling for Officer Calloway's immediate termination? Will you be taking legal action against the police department? Do you believe this was a racially motivated attack?" Marcus raised a hand, silencing them. His eyes burned with cold fire. "Officer Calloway should be fired and charged. The system that protects men like him should be dismantled. And yes, I will be pursuing every legal avenue to ensure that no other family has to suffer this kind of injustice again." Aaliyah and Zuri sat frozen, their emotions a tangled knot of fear, pride, and exhaustion. They had become the center of something much bigger than themselves. And the storm was only just beginning. Officer Richard Calloway sat in the dimly lit bar, his fingers clenched around a sweating glass of whiskey. His face was splashed across every news channel, every website. The media was tearing him apart. "Goddamn bullshit," he muttered, taking a sharp swig of his drink. A few of his fellow officers sat around him, their expressions unreadable. Some murmured words of support. Others stayed quiet, unwilling to openly align themselves with a man whose career was now hanging by a thread. "They're making a martyr out of those girls," one of them finally said. Calloway scoffed. "Martyr? Give me a break. Those brats disrespected me. They had an attitude, acting like they were better than me. You heard who their dad is." Another officer warned. "You should have backed off." "Rich." Calloway's face twisted with rage. "Oh, so now we're bowing to politicians? I didn't do anything wrong." The men exchanged glances, but no one argued. The truth was, they had all seen this play out before. A cop gets caught. The department scrambles to protect its own. Public outcry grows. Then, eventually, everything dies down. But this time, it felt different. A captain approached their table. His expression unreadable. "Calloway, Chief wants you at the station." "Now." Calloway smirked, pushing back from the bar. "Finally. About time they start backing me up." But when he arrived, he realized the truth. The chief wasn't protecting him. He was throwing him to the wolves. "You're suspended indefinitely," Chief Warren said, folding his hands across his desk. "Pending investigation." Calloway's mouth fell open. "You're kidding me. We had to do this. Rich, the pressure is too high. You're just gonna let them ruin me?" Calloway's voice cracked with desperation. Warren exhaled slowly. "You dug your own grave." Calloway stormed out of the office, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Zuri hadn't slept in 2 days. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. The roughness of Calloway's hands. The way he shoved her. The way he looked at them like they were nothing. The fear. The helplessness. She hated it. "Aaliyah," she whispered, rolling over. "Are you awake?" Her sister's bed creaked as Aaliyah turned to face her. "Yeah. Are we gonna be okay?" Zuri's voice was small. She hated that it was small. Aaliyah exhaled. "I don't know." There was a knock at their door. Their mother peeked inside. "Girls, there's someone downstairs to see you." They exchanged glances before slowly getting up. As they made their way down the grand staircase, they saw their father speaking in hushed tones with a woman in a crisp black suit. The woman turned to face them. "My name is Danielle Carter," she said, offering a small smile. "I'm a civil rights attorney. Your father has asked me to represent you in this case." Zuri's stomach tightened. "A case?" Danielle nodded. "If you're willing, we can take this to court. We can fight for justice." Aaliyah swallowed hard. "And what if we lose?" Danielle's expression turned steely. "We won't." Zuri's fingers trembled. The idea of standing in a courtroom, reliving everything, was terrifying. But the alternative, staying silent, was worse. She glanced at Aaliyah, then back at Danielle. "Okay," she said softly, "let's do it." By the end of the week, the protests had spread across the country. In major cities, thousands of people gathered, holding signs that bore Aaliyah and Zuri's names. "Justice for the Johnson twins. Protect black children. Calloway must go." The country had drawn its battle lines. On one side were those demanding justice. Those who had seen too many young black lives torn apart by systemic racism. They marched. They chanted. They made sure the world heard them. On the other side were those defending Calloway. Twisting the story. Trying to make Aaliyah and Zuri the villains. They were being disrespectful. One conservative pundit sneered on a talk show. What was the officer supposed to do? Let them walk away? The smear campaign began immediately. Old photos were pulled from the twins' social media accounts. Pictures of them at parties. Laughing with friends. Wearing crop tops. Somehow, this was supposed to justify what had happened. Zuri sat on the couch, scrolling through the internet, bile rising in her throat. "They're acting like we deserved it." Aaliyah snatched the phone away. "Stop reading that garbage." "But what if people believe it?" Their father walked into the room, looking weary but determined. "Let them talk," he said. "The truth is on our side. And I promise you, girls, we're not going to let them win." The war for justice had begun. And they weren't backing down. The courtroom had yet to be scheduled. But the trial had already begun in the streets, on social media, and across the national news cycle. Aaliyah and Zuri had become symbols of something far greater than themselves. Their faces were plastered across posters. Their names chanted at protests. And their story dissected on every news program. Marcus Johnson had anticipated the backlash. But he hadn't expected the sheer brutality of the attacks against his daughters. Late at night, he sat at the dining table with his wife, Angela, reviewing the latest headlines, entitled "Twins of Politician Cry Racism for Attention." Officer Calloway falsely accused by privileged teens. Were the Johnson twins actually shoplifting? He clenched his jaw, the rage simmering beneath his skin. "Marcus," Angela said softly, resting a hand on his. "You need to sleep." "I can't," he muttered. "They're tearing them apart. They're strong," she reminded him, but her own voice was laced with worry. "They have you. They have us. We'll get through this." The twins had been keeping their heads down, trying to block out the noise. But it was impossible to ignore the vitriol. Messages flooded their social media, some offering support, others spewing hate. You're a disgrace. Stay strong. We're behind you. Just another race-baiting scam. I hope you rot. One night, Aaliyah lay in bed, scrolling through the messages until her vision blurred with tears. Zuri, lying next to her, took the phone from her hands and locked it. Stop reading that, Zuri whispered. How can I stop? Aaliyah whispered back, her voice cracking. They hate us. They don't even know us. And they hate us. They're scared, Zuri said, staring up at the ceiling. That's why they fight so hard to make it seem like it's our fault. If they admit the truth, they'd have to admit that the whole system is broken. Aaliyah wiped her eyes. I hate this. I know. They fell asleep, holding on to each other, while outside, the country continued to argue over their fate. As the legal battle ramped up, the police department launched its counterattack. Officer Calloway had been suspended, but his allies within the force were determined to protect him. Chief Warren held a press conference, his expression grim as he addressed the accusations. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously, he said, but let me be clear, Officer Calloway is a decorated officer with over a decade of service. We urge the public to let the investigation run its course before passing judgment. The damage control had begun. That evening, the twins watched the press conference from the living room. Aaliyah scoffed. A decorated officer? That's what they're calling him. Marcus muted the TV. It's what they do. They paint him as the hero and you as the villains. That's why we need to stay ahead of them. Danielle Carter, their lawyer, was already 10 steps ahead. She had spent days digging into Calloway's record, and what she found was damning. Calloway had a history of misconduct complaints, excessive force, unlawful searches, multiple reports from Black and Latino families, all dismissed without consequence. We release this to the press, Danielle said, and suddenly he's not the golden boy anymore. Marcus exhaled. Do it. Within hours, the internet was flooded with reports on Calloway's past. People demanded to know why he had never been disciplined. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "How many more victims? Fire Calloway now." The department scrambled to respond. But behind closed doors, the officers who had supported Calloway were starting to distance themselves. He was no longer their problem. Calloway sat in his apartment, watching his life unravel in real time. He flipped through news channels, his name and face on every single one. His lawyer had advised him to stay quiet, but he couldn't stand it anymore. Grabbing his phone, he typed out a furious message. I did my job. I did nothing wrong. This is a witch hunt. He hesitated for only a second before posting it. Within minutes, his supporters, conservative media, police unions, far-right activists, rallied behind him. That same night, a rally was held in his name. People waved blue line flags. Speakers ranted about the war on cops. And amidst the crowd, a woman named Lillian Gage, a right-wing journalist, made a chilling announcement. The Johnson twins are trying to destroy a good man's life. We won't let that happen. We need to find out everything about them. Their past, their secrets. If they want a war, we'll give them one. The crowd cheered. Calloway smirked. Maybe he wasn't done just yet. The attacks came swiftly. By morning, a viral post surfaced with a photo of Zuri at a party from 2 years ago, holding a red plastic cup. The caption read, "This is the innocent girl we're supposed to believe? Underage drinking, breaking the law, but she's the victim?" Another post surfaced of Aaliyah arguing with a teacher in class, completely out of context, entitled and aggressive. Not so innocent now, huh? The Johnson family's private life was being torn apart. Angela Johnson's old college essays were dug up and scrutinized. Marcus's past policies were twisted against him. The message was clear. If they couldn't win the argument, they would destroy the family. Danielle clenched her fists as she scrolled through the posts. They're trying to discredit you. Aaliyah sat on the couch, staring blankly at the screen. Zuri paced the room. They're making us look like criminals. Zuri muttered. They always do. Marcus said bitterly. Aaliyah finally spoke. We need to fight back. Danielle hesitated. How? Aaliyah turned to her father. You have connections. You know people in the media. Let's use them. If they want to dig into our past, let's dig into theirs. Danielle nodded slowly. I can find out who's funding Calloway's defense, who's behind these attacks, and once we know, we expose them. Angela sighed. I hate that it has to be like this. Marcus looked at his daughters. Then at his wife. We didn't start this fight. But we're damn sure going to finish it. Zuri clenched her jaw. Then let's make them regret coming after us. The war had officially escalated. And no one was backing down. The courthouse was surrounded by a sea of protesters. Their chants echoing through the city streets. News crews lined the sidewalk. Cameras flashing as Marcus Johnson stepped out of the black SUV. His daughters beside him, Aaliyah and Zuri, held their heads high. Their hands tightly intertwined. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The prosecution had built a solid case against Richard Calloway. They had video evidence, eyewitnesses, and a long list of misconduct complaints that painted a damning picture. But Calloway's defense team was ruthless. Danielle Carter sat across from them, her expression cool and unreadable. She had anticipated their strategy. They would try to discredit the girls, twist their words, and make it seem like Calloway was just doing his job. As the trial began, Calloway's lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Philip Grayson, stood before the jury, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me be clear. This is not a case about race," he began. "This is about law and order. Officer Calloway was doing his duty, protecting our streets. The Johnson twins acted suspiciously, refused to cooperate, and are now using their father's political influence to ruin an officer's career." Marcus clenched his jaw, but Danielle placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay composed. The first witness was a bystander who had filmed the incident. He described how Calloway had approached the girls with immediate hostility, how he had thrown them against the wall without cause. Philip Grayson stepped forward. "Did you witness the entire interaction, sir?" The man hesitated. "I saw enough. But you didn't see what happened before you started recording, did you?" The witness hesitated again. "No, but then you don't actually know if the officer had reason to stop them, do you?" Danielle stood abruptly. "Objection." Leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said, shooting Grayson a warning glance. Grayson smirked, turning back toward the jury. "Just something to consider." The twins exchanged a nervous glance. The defense wasn't here to prove Calloway's innocence. They were here to create doubt. And doubt, in a case like this, could be deadly. The trial stretched for days, each session more exhausting than the last. The twins had yet to take the stand. But when the day came, their nerves were raw. Zuri was up first. She sat stiffly in the witness chair, her hands clenched together in her lap. Danielle walked up to her, voice gentle. "Can you tell us what happened that night? In your own words?" Zuri inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain steady. "We were walking home. We didn't do anything wrong. The officer stopped us, accused us of stealing. We told him we hadn't. But he didn't listen. He pushed us against the wall, frisked us like we were criminals. He didn't care that we were just kids." Danielle nodded. "And how did that make you feel?" Zuri's voice cracked. "Like we didn't matter. Like we were nothing." A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. Then came cross-examination. Philip Grayson stood, his expression unreadable. "Miss Johnson, did you comply when Officer Calloway asked you to stop?" Zuri hesitated. Yes or no?" "I asked him why," she said. "So you didn't comply immediately?" "I didn't resist." "Did you comply immediately?" "No," she admitted. Philip turned to the jury. "And there it is." Danielle stood. "Objection." The witness was within her legal rights to ask why she was being stopped. "Overruled," the judge said. Zuri's stomach dropped. She could see it already, the narrative shifting. When Aaliyah took the stand, it was worse. Philip played the video of her calling Calloway a bastard before he shoved her against the wall. "So you verbally insulted a police officer before he laid a hand on you?" Aaliyah gritted her teeth. "I was defending my sister." "But you admit to being aggressive? If someone was hurting your family, would you stay silent?" she shot back. Philip smirked, sensing the jury's discomfort. Marcus clenched his fists. This wasn't just a trial. It was a battlefield. The trial neared its end, and the jury deliberated for hours. Protesters gathered outside, their voices echoing in the streets. Some called for Calloway's conviction. Others called for his acquittal, claiming the Johnson twins had ruined a good cop's life. Inside, Aaliyah and Zuri sat together, their father's arm around them. "What if we lose?" Zuri whispered. Marcus's face was unreadable. "Then we fight harder." Danielle paced, her phone in hand. The jury is taking their time. That could be good. Or bad. Then, the announcement came. The jury had reached a verdict. Aaliyah's stomach twisted as they were led back into the courtroom. Calloway sat across from them, looking pale but still defiant. The judge turned to the foreperson. Has the jury reached a decision? The woman, a middle-aged juror with tired eyes, nodded. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom fell into an unbearable silence. In the case of the People versus Officer Richard Calloway, on the charge of excessive force. A pause. We find the defendant. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, cries of triumph or outrage. Aaliyah couldn't process it at first. Calloway sat motionless, absorbing the weight of the words. Convicted. He was convicted. Aaliyah felt Zuri gripping her hand. And then suddenly they were pulled into their father's embrace. Marcus was shaking, his usually unbreakable composure cracking. Danielle exhaled sharply, looking momentarily stunned before a slow, victorious smile spread across her face. But the victory was not complete. Outside, the city erupted. Protests turned into celebrations in some places and riots in others. Calloway's supporters refused to accept the verdict. Police officers resigned in protest. The media spun its own narratives. An innocent man railroaded by the system, one anchor claimed. Justice at last, another countered. Calloway was led away in handcuffs. His face blank, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Marcus turned to his daughters. This isn't over. And he was right. Justice had been served, but the fight for change was far from finished. Aaliyah and Zuri weren't just victims anymore. They were warriors. And the war was only just beginning. The night of the verdict. The city did not sleep. The streets pulsed with raw emotion, celebration in some corners, fury in others. The chants of protesters still rang through the air, their voices demanding more than just one conviction. Aaliyah and Zuri sat in their father's study, watching the news coverage unfold. Footage of Calloway being led away in handcuffs played in a continuous loop on the screen. A chyron scrolled beneath it. Officer Calloway found guilty, nation divided over verdict. Zuri let out a hollow laugh. Divided? Like there's anything to be divided about. Aaliyah rubbed her arms, still feeling the phantom weight of Calloway's hands on her. They act like this is just about him. Like this isn't about every cop who got away with it before. Their father entered, his expression grim. He had barely spoken since the trial ended, his mind already racing ahead. We need to be ready, he said. Angela, their mother, followed behind him, crossing her arms. Ready for what, Marcus? The trial is over. Marcus shook his head. This is bigger than Calloway. The system doesn't like to lose. They'll come for us. For the girls. For the movement. Angela frowned. We've already won. For now, Marcus said, but they won't let it rest. Danielle Carter, their lawyer, arrived moments later, her face tight with concern. She placed her bag on the desk and pulled out a folder. They're already planning an appeal, she said, looking at Marcus. Calloway's defense is arguing procedural misconduct, claiming media influence tainted the jury. Zuri scoffed. Oh, so now they care about justice? Aaliyah's stomach twisted. How long until he's actually sentenced? Danielle exhaled. A few months. But they'll drag it out as long as possible. Marcus nodded. We can't let them. Angela looked between them, worry lining her face. What are you saying? Marcus's eyes burned with determination. We take this fight national. We make sure that even if Calloway appeals, even if he gets out early, the system that let him exist in the first place doesn't. Aaliyah and Zuri exchanged glances. They had started this fight as victims. Now, they were being asked to be something else entirely. Leaders. The backlash came swiftly. Within days, Marcus Johnson was targeted by conservative media, painted as a radical, an enemy of law enforcement. The twins, still reeling from the trial, became the center of a war they hadn't fully prepared for. Right-wing pundits dissected their every move. Why are these girls still in the spotlight? Was this ever about justice? Or just about fame? Marcus Johnson is using his daughters to push an agenda. Is this about police brutality or his political career? Threats filled their inboxes, their social media accounts, their home. Late one evening, a rock shattered their front window. The sound jolted Aaliyah and Zuri awake. Angela screamed from the hallway. Rushing toward them, Marcus was already by the front door, gun in hand. His security team bolted outside, but whoever had done it was long gone. Zuri stood frozen, staring at the broken glass scattered across the floor. They're trying to scare us. Angela pulled her into her arms. But Aaliyah just clenched her fists. It won't work, Aaliyah said, her voice shaking. We're not stopping. The next day, she and Zuri stood beside their father at a rally, staring out into a crowd of thousands. Signs bearing their names, their faces, filled the air. The people were looking to them now. Marcus spoke first, but it was Aaliyah who stepped up to the microphone, surprising everyone, including herself. They tried to break us, she said, voice strong despite the fear bubbling in her chest. They tried to make us believe that we were the problem, that we were wrong for fighting back. But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. The crowd roared. That night, the twins sat together, their backs against the wall of their bedroom. Did you ever think this would happen? Zuri whispered. Aaliyah shook her head. No, but we can't turn back now. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. The months following the trial were a whirlwind. Protests surged across the country. People demanded national reform, better training, accountability, the end of police unions protecting violent officers. The pressure mounted, and the political divide deepened. One night, Marcus Johnson was scheduled to speak at a university panel on police reform. Aaliyah and Zuri sat in the front row, watching as he debated a former police chief live on air. The conversation was heated. You want to dismantle law enforcement, the chief accused. Marcus leaned forward. I want to dismantle the corruption that allows officers like Richard Calloway to thrive. I want accountability, not lawlessness. As the debate raged, Zuri scrolled through her phone, her heart skipping a beat when she saw a message flash across the screen. You think you've won? Watch your back. She looked up at Aaliyah, whispering, they're not done with us. Aaliyah's stomach churned. The threats had never stopped. But something about this felt different. Later that night, as they left the building, a dark SUV sat idling across the street. The security detail noticed it immediately, moving to block the family as they got into their car. As the engine started, a loud bang shattered the air. Screams erupted. The SUV peeled away, disappearing into the night. The security team scrambled, voices shouting into radios. Marcus pulled Aaliyah and Zuri close. Are you hurt? No, Aaliyah whispered, her hands trembling. Zuri's breath was ragged. They're trying to kill us. Angela sat frozen, her hands gripping her seat. Marcus, this has to stop. Marcus's face was like stone. It won't stop until we finish this. Weeks later, the FBI arrested several men tied to white supremacist groups for orchestrating the attack. The news sent shockwaves across the country. Calloway's appeal was denied. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Marcus Johnson's political career skyrocketed. The movement he had ignited pushed real legislative change. Police reform bills were introduced. Some passed. Some were still fought over. But the world was changing. Aaliyah and Zuri stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the reporters, the people who had followed their story from the beginning. We were just two girls walking home, Aaliyah said, and we became a movement. We didn't ask for this fight. Zuri added, but we won't walk away from it. The war wasn't over, but they had won this battle. As they walked away, the chants of the crowd followed them. Justice for the Johnson twins. The world had tried to silence them, but their voices would never be silenced again.